Hello, he's not here.
So we are waiting. Huh?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hello.
The future of critical idealism, reflections of thinking. Please, Andrea, your word.
Can I? Can I begin?
Yes.
Good. Good evening, and thanks to my colleague and friend Vladimir Belov, who invited me. I apologize for the misunderstanding of last Friday, but now I am punctually here. can you hear me, Claire?
Yes, I hear you, but not very well for me. Oh.
So, oh la 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 la. No, no, no. Now can you hear me?
Yes, more better, please. Thanks. Oh, yes. We see you. Андреа,
Микрофон. Микрофон.
microphone check
Microphone.
off. We didn't hear Андреа. Microphone. No. Андреа, we didn't hear you. You.
Yeah, now it's good.
Yes.
Good.
Now it's good.
So my topic is the future of the critical idealism, but in my mind, it would be more precise to say the present of the critical idealism, because the social conditions and the mission of the critical idealism that I try to describe are not in the future, but in the present of the in which we are living today. I will make some brief reflections on this present of critical idealism. The starting assumption of my contribution is that postmodernism is not a philosophical current, but the social and cultural situation in which we have been living and thinking for almost half a century. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, a series of works appeared that, despite being surely different from one another, together indicated a cultural turning point, of which they offered an in-depth analysis and with reference to which they tried to propose various philosophical programs. The term postmodernism, first used to indicate an architectural aesthetic current, was adopted by philosophy to denote the new era and new culture. In my opinion, it is important to distinguish postmodernism from the complex cultural process of anti-modernism that preceded it. In fact, at the end of the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century, there was a vast cultural movement of rejection and destruction of all the cornerstones of modern culture. This involved all areas: philosophy, science, art, morality, politics, and so forth. This multifaceted dismantling of ideas, concepts, ideas, and prejudices which effectively got rid of the ideologies of a culture that in its epigonic deformations had shown all its vanity, must still be considered the final phase of modernity. The latter, in fact, characterized by its own critical capacity, harbored the hilty germ of dialectical negation and of the radical contestation of its own contents, when faced with the inconsistency and falsity of their latter developments. Postmodern culture only appeared after this destructive work had been accomplished in the void of all forms left by such destruction. The most striking feature of this new culture is the conviction of not having to build something new, but of having and waiting to remain in this absence of any constituted form. The in-depth analysis of the postmodern condition was already carried out in those years, especially in France, by several authors such as Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Lyotard, and others. In what follows, I will try to make only a few brief considerations using my own interpretative categories as explained elsewhere. From a structural point of view, the postmodern condition is characterized as a fully realized capitalism. Classic capitalism was characterized by two main assumptions. On the one hand, the reduction of all value to exchange value, and the unconditional freedom of market flows. On the other hand, private ownership of the means of production. The second characteristic has now become secondary and irrelevant due to the ever-decreasing role of production in the economy and to the now almost total depersonalization of the ownership of capital. From the ideological point of view, the postmodern episteme can be essentially described by three fundamental characteristics. A, the rejection of the thought of the identity qua representative and totalitarian, as opposed to the thought of differences. B, the destruction of the identical and coherent subject, as opposed to a broken subject. C, the denial of a univocal and undisputed teleology, and therefore the problematization of the very concept of history. While accepting these epistemic characteristics as impassable and such as to legitimize any philosophical reflection only if it unfolds within them, it must, however, be admitted that the postmodern condition, like every culture, allows for multiple different or even opposing cultural projects. Most postmodern authors, though not all, have developed a programmatic thought which I designate as Dionysian thought. In general, it is characterized by an apologia of the absence of form, understood as an emancipation from any codification and the possibility of the anarchic expression of drives, regardless of any ethical injunction. Primary sources of inspiration for this thought are certainly the philosophy of Nietzsche, Marxism, Freudism, and structuralism, although radically criticized and used for entirely new developments, as well as various other philosophical, literary, and artistic sources. As opposed to this program, I have sought to propose a completely alternative one, which I have called lyrical thought. This thought, while respecting the epistemic characteristics of postmodernity, acknowledges the general absence of form, but proposes to experience it and to understand it in the perspective of the Sehnsucht, of the yearning, understood as the feeling of the presence of absence. This is the definition of sense of yearning that I decide. Yearning, Sehnsucht, is the presence of absence. This sentiment, characteristic of the lyrical song, gives the postmodern condition a very different meaning from that of Dionysian joy for the emancipation from every form. It consists in the awareness of the absence of forms, experienced in a vigilant and active way, and oriented to the expectation of new forms, or better, to new formulations of form. Lyrical thought, therefore, does not claim to enthusiastically emancipate itself from ethics, but on the contrary, it keeps alive the ethical requirement of humor, which consists in the logical, ethical, and aesthetic ability to recognize the partial, defective, and provisional, but effective presence of the infinite form in its historical realizations. The main sources of lyrical thought lie in the tradition of critical idealism, whose greatest exponents are Plato, Leibniz, Kant, and Hermann Cohen, besides many others. It is within this programmatic line that I think we should highlight the importance of Cohen's legacy in the current postmodern situation. This is the intent of my work and of the present intervention, in which I will try to summarize the results I have achieved, proposing that we investigate together the many aspects still to be developed and the problems still to be solved. Critical idealism, ever since its inception, has conceived of being as difference and of thought as a thought of differences. I will only mention Plato's lesson in the Parmenides and in the Sophist, Leibniz's important theory of the existence of all that is possible, or Kant's notable strong point of the indeducibility of the practical principle from freedom. If this tradition had prevailed over the Aristotelian one, which it did not, today we would not find ourselves faced with the hard task of freeing the thought of being from the chains of identity. One can also find important references for the thought of differences in Cohen. In fact, for Cohen, thought does not arise from the principle of identity, but rather from the principle of origin, which derives being from non-being, thus constituting the difference as origin. I would also refer to Cohen's view of the concept as a cached question open to the indefinite system of possible meanings, as he clarifies when explaining the meaning of the principle of the excluded third, which, as the principle of the system, is actually the principle of inclusion of every third. As shown by these few hints, it is not at all difficult to show that Hermann Cohen's philosophy is the conception of thought as judgment, not as a representation, and cannot be reduced to identity. As for the broken subject, while not denying the unitary character of the Cohenian subject, we can legitimately affirm that it is constituted as an infinitely open subject. See, for example, the treatment of the concept of conscience in the Logik des reinen Denkens, or the constitution of the unity of action and of the subject as an infinite task in Ethik des reinen Willens. As for teleology, it cannot be denied that Cohen, a modern thinker in all respects, does not question this idea. However, the completely open character of his conception of history and his humanistic conception indefinitely in theory allow us to find important themes of inspiration in his thought also in this regard. A lyrical thought inspired by the tradition of critical idealism, and in particular by the philosophy of Hermann Cohen, can therefore be formulated and proposed as a postmodern philosophical project, alternative to Dionysian thought, characterized as rational and rigorously rationalistic, as founded on a deontological ethical perspective, as intrinsically humanistic. This is certainly not the reproposition of either ontological or epistemological humanism, which have already demonstrated their unsustainability. Rather, it is a humanism not based on an alleged definition of man, but on the recognition of the human attribute as a regulative idea. The latter, in this sense, comes prior to any ethical judgment, and at the same time is able to indicate the direction for the formulation of ethics, and with it for the constitution, never completed but effectively in itinere, of the meanings and of the multiple but not relativistic sense of man, of his cultures and his stories. As is known, Hermann Cohen's Ethik des reinen Willens often talks about humanness, Humanität, as a second-order virtue complementary to justice. In that chapter, however, the meaning of humanness emerges as much larger and more important than that of one of the virtues. Certainly, in the sense of fairness, it tempers justice, making it less rigid, not indifferent to the circumstances and the context, and therefore, in fact, more just in its judgments. But what's more, humanness is also the disposition to the relationship with others prior to and independently from any judgment. This fundamental disposition, which expresses itself as courtesy, as harmony, and as peace, is more original than ethics, more original than ethics. It comes before any judgment about what is good and what is evil. It is therefore a regulative idea for ethics, in whose perspective only it is possible to formulate theories and rules for action and behavior. The common feeling of what is human and what is not human or anti-human is not defined once and for all, and yet is tendentially understood and shared. It is not an ethical principle, but the condition for the formulation of legitimate principles, laws, and rules of behavior. This regulative horizon opens up the possibility of ethical pluralism without giving way to relativism, because it indicates a rule and a direction within which to establish the legitimacy of principles, laws, and rules of behavior. Not quite the foundation of ethical legitimacy, but the sphere within which it is possible to produce this foundation, and based on it, the plurality of legitimate laws and rules, as well as the exclusion of illegitimate ones. By learning and realizing what is human and avoiding what is anti-human, human beings and societies know and realize themselves in a never completed but effective progression, in an infinite self-determination of their own ought to be. I am aware that these few references are not sufficient to illustrate the program of lyrical thought, even if just in broad terms. Over the past years, I have carved out a little more detailed overview on this subject and made it available in previous publications. My aim here is solely to point out the possibility of celebrating the great work of a philosopher who died a century ago, Hermann Cohen, not only as the philosophy of a great classic of thought, but also as a reference of fundamental importance for contemporary philosophy in the age of postmodernity. In order to formulate the program of a lyrical thought for postmodernity in its various aspects and its many implications, it is certainly not enough to indicate a few programmatic lines. What is required is a long process to elaborate on every concept, to discuss every problem, to examine every possible objection. I hope that if these programmatic lines are considered persuasive, this task will be carried out in the future by me or by others. The tradition of critical idealism, and within it, with particular value, the lesson of Hermann Cohen, will certainly provide a sure guiding light for this task. Among the many problems to be addressed, here I will only mention one, because I think it is particularly important, but also difficult to solve.
Vortrag. Ja,
Ja.
und in dieser Überlegungen nun implizit gibt es eine Question oder eine Position, mit dem du hast dagegen oder
Ja, ja.
it's deine Position. Ja, ich legte meine erste Replik da. In my opinion, there are two main schemes for the development of philosophy, or only for assisting this development. Let me emphasize that this is a subjective and very approximate approach. Conventionally, I call them heterological and dialogical. First, the first advocates the independence and equidistance of various schools and directions, and the attempts of the next generation of philosophers to deepen one on another approach, focusing on its fundamental nature, originality, and possibility of deepening and expanding due to internal selves. The second insists on the possibility and necessity of overcoming, removing the previous stage as a result of a productive synthesis of the best achievements of various schools of thought. If we talk about the fate of critical idealism, then these schemes can be depicted as follows.